Okay, and we're back. So this little lesson is going to be about what are seams. What is a seam? And another term that we use very often is seam allowance. So I've placed my little sample under the presser foot ready to go, and you'll notice I didn't draw any blue lines here because I wanted to demonstrate a concept which is called seam allowance. Now, if I sew with the needle position where it's going to land currently, on this machine, you'll see there's some marks on the thread plate, and they are 1/2 centimeter apart, each one of them. So if I now sew currently where the needle position is, and I let the edge of the fabric be on this line here, you'll notice it's exactly 3 marks away from the middle of the presser foot where the needle is, and that gives us 1.5 centimeters. So from the needle to the edge of the fabric is 1.5 centimeters. So that means the seam allowance is equal to 1.5 centimeters. So that means if I keep on sewing with the edge of my fabric, the raw edge as we call it, being right on top of that line, as I go, I'm going to sew the same distance from the raw edge, which is going to give me a nice consistent seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. Okay. So seam allowance is really important because we have quite a few seams on a garment, and so obviously if we don't get this part right, the accuracy of the size of the garment or whatever project we're making is going to be inaccurate. So it's very important to adhere to the right seam allowance, and this seam allowance is very commonly used. 1.5 centimeters is very common. Last thing I'll mention about seam allowances is we like to use patterns at the So Much Fun Studio that don't contain the seam allowance, because we can then choose what kind of seams we want to use and what kind of seam allowance we want to use as well. So different seams have different amounts of seam allowance. So think of the seam allowance as the budget of fabric you require to make the join in the 2 pieces of fabric. So a seam, the simplest way to describe it is wherever you join 2 pieces of fabric. So here we've got 1 and 2 pieces of fabric, we've joined them together. This is called a seam. Okay. We're far from done though, because in addition to the seam allowance, we'll also do something called a seam finish. So all seams will get a seam finish. So in most cases, we won't leave this edge like that, because with time it's just going to unravel until there's nothing left but a little fringe. Okay, so that is the most basic seam that we can do, and you'll notice all of the examples that we sew, we always use 2 different colors of thread, so that we can see what's the top thread and what's the bottom thread. And it will help you to memorize the processes, because with sewing everything is reliant on the order in which we do things. So it's very good to know what's the top of your garment or the bottom or whatever, whether you're sewing a pillowcase or a face mask. We need to know what's the top and bottom, or the inside and the outside, or in this case, as we would refer to it, the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. So this seam is the most simple one that we can get. It's called a plain seam. And if we join 2 pieces of fabric with a plain seam, we'll put right sides together. So right side, and this would be known as the wrong side and the wrong side. Okay, and if this was a garment, this would be the outside of the garment, and this would be the inside. Okay, that's seams and seam allowance in a nutshell. More to follow.